and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Wednesday. Tonight, Stellantis heads south.
If you can't get a deal, let's start hitting them back.
We just can't smile while they steal our jobs.
We will make sure that we push the company and we hold them to account.
Auto giant Stellantis deals a blow to Brampton, Ontario and Canada, shifting production and thousands of jobs to Illinois as Trump's desire to move manufacturing to the U.S. is borne out. In moments, we'll get reaction from Brampton's Mayor, Patrick Brown, and Conservative Labour critic Kyle Seaback. Then, our front bench is set to dig into the political stakes and strategies for the federal government with the negotiating team back in Washington as we speak. Plus, election upset.
There is nothing quite like a comeback.
Progressive Conservative leader Tony Wakeham defeats the incumbent Liberals in Newfoundland and Labrador in the provincial election there, an outcome no poll was predicting. The incoming Premier will join us live a little bit later on in the show. First, though.
Not only am I disappointed, it's completely unacceptable. So we will fight for these jobs.
Mark Carney's broken promises and weakness abroad are costing Canadian workers at home.
What my message to the Prime Minister when I meet him on Thursday is if you can't get a deal, let's start hitting him back.
I think we do have a few cards, and it's important that we play those cards well. 40% of our sales are American-built vehicles here in Canada.
We should keep the company to account, and they make lots of cars in lots of places around the world. Find one, put it in Brampton.
If we're not going to fight for the auto sector and the 150,000 direct jobs in that sector, what are we willing to fight for?
Reaction there to a massive blow to Canada's already embattled auto industry. 3,000 Brampton, Ontario jobs are at risk as auto giant Stellantis announces it's moving production of the Jeep Compass to the U.S. and investing billions south of the border in the process. CTV News has obtained a letter Industry Minister Melanie Joly has sent to the company saying the federal government is considering legal action against the automaker due to funding commitments the feds in Ontario made to the company. In a statement to CTV News, Stellantis says Canada is, quote, very important to the company, and there will be plans to share about Brampton soon following discussions with the government. Joining us now on the impact of this move by Stellantis and the wider implications for the economy in the wake of Trump's trade war is Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown. Mayor Brown, good to have you back on the program. Thank you very much for making the time.
My pleasure.
I have to start on those jobs that are so clearly at risk. Do you have any clarity at this hour on whether those jobs are gone?
Well, we don't have clarity, and it's a punch in the gut, this news. 3,000 workers, highly trained, highly skilled, who have devoted their life to this assembly plant. We're expecting to go back to work in short order. And this pause was set up for the retooling, which was subsidized by the Government of Canada and the province of Ontario. And so the Jeep Compass was meant to go into production, and now that it's going to Illinois, the families are devastated. It's ugly news for our community. There's no way to put lipstick on the pig. This is ugly news for our community. It's going to hurt, and there's numerous associated jobs that are going to be affected by it.
I know that you've been in touch with the company. I assume there has been some communication, rather, with the governments at both the provincial and the federal level. Is anyone providing you with assurances that there's a possibility, for example, those jobs will stay?
No. Stellantis said yesterday that if there's a trade agreement, if tariffs are lifted, that there's a business case for production in Canada. But they said with these tariffs, there's simply not a business case. And so they were not hopeful. They said down the road, we can look at production, but there's too many ifs in that equation to give any comfort to myself or the workers that have lost their jobs. And we're angry. This is a company that in 2009, when they were on their heels in the global economic slowdown, the Government of Canada stepped up and helped them. In 2022, it was Prime Minister Trudeau and Premier Ford that invested in the retooling in Windsor and in Brampton. And given the amount of assistance they've had from the Canadian taxpayers, the fact that they would quit and run so quickly based on Donald Trump's tariff policy is extremely disappointing.
So the Federal Minister of Industry has indicated that she's considering legal action. I don't know the terms of the contract that was signed over the investments that you referenced. You probably have a better idea. Do you think that there is some sort of legal recourse, and is that something that you would support?
I'd absolutely support that. I think we should use all legal tools to hold them accountable for the subsidies they accepted. And whether it's in 2009 or today, they've had a partnership with the Canadian government based on their long-term commitment in Canada. Melanie Joly's chief of staff reached out today. They mentioned they were sending this letter, and I'm encouraged by that. I want the government of Canada to look at legal options. Frankly, I think Brampton is a test. If we roll over and just let Trump steal another factory from Canada, he will replicate that elsewhere. This needs to be painful for Stellantis. And frankly, it's time for us to punch back, as Premier Ford said. We dropped retaliatory tariffs under the hopes that we could get a deal done with the U.S. That was Canada's collaborative position. It doesn't appear to be working. And my larger worry is that if he's successful in the auto sector in stealing these jobs from Canada, it's not going to stop there. It'll be aluminum, it'll be steel. He has telegraphed this. He's been very blunt and transparent of what his intentions are. This is an attack on the Canadian economy and in any area he believes we compete.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I did want to ask, there's obviously what's happening in Brampton, but there are comments straight from the president last week in the Oval Office, right down to his delegate as far as the trade file goes, and Howard Lutnick, who was extremely blunt with a Toronto audience. I'm sure you've heard all about it, about the fact that they don't want to buy cars in Canada anymore, that maybe they'll buy parts, but Canada should come second to the United States. There is a very live debate happening right now, politically speaking, about what the government should do in response, how far they should retaliate. You referenced Premier Ford, who says he's going to sit down with the Prime Minister tomorrow and urge him to hit back harder as well. When you say hit back harder, what specific changes in Canada's posture would you like to see materialize? How would you like to see the federal government do that?
Well, right now, we're in a trade war with the U.S., one that we don't want. And obviously, I'd love an agreement that, like we had before, that worked for Canada and the U.S. But, we can't be blind to the reality. We're being hit again and again and again. Every few days, it seems like there's an announcement of tariffs on new sectors in Canada. And I think partly the reason for that is that we haven't pushed back, that we've abandoned those retaliatory tariffs. And so I would say the retaliatory tariffs that were looked at, less than a year ago need to be on the table again in any area that the U.S. depends on. We've heard many stories from U.S. mayors and U.S. elected officials and industry leaders that they depend on Canada. Well, in those areas that they depend on us, whether it's natural resources, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's commodities, that they depend on this relationship with Canada, just like they've gone after our sectors, we need to put tariffs on those products going to the U.S.
The federal government, has been questioned, and the Prime Minister himself frequently on this basis. And the response, if I understand it correctly, seems to be something along the lines of that would jeopardize what exists right now, that so much of what we do have is covered by CUSMA outside of the sectoral tariffs that are in place. And that, as they mentioned last week, there could be a deal on the table, and we see no evidence of that at this point, but that there could be a deal on the table where steel and aluminum and energy are concerned. The word autos didn't come up. The word forestry didn't come up. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't want a deal at any expense. A deal that abandons the auto sector isn't a deal that I think is good for Canada. And to the 3,000 workers in my community and many more that will come in associated sectors, that would not be comforting. And so I do believe, that a bully doesn't respond to someone that rolls over, that you have to push back. And I think now is the time to leverage those tools that we have to let Donald Trump know that we're not going to take this line down. I just feel that it's been, smiling, grinning, shaking hands, trying to make the best of a bad situation. But it really is putting, lipstick on a pig. It's ugly right now. Canada's under economic attack by this U.S. administration.
All right, Mayor Brown, I'm going to leave it on that note. Appreciate your time this evening very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick Brown is the mayor of Brampton, Ontario. We did invite several representatives from the federal and Ontario governments on the show today to respond to this news. No federal minister, secretary of state, parliamentary secretary, or Brampton MP was available for our show. Ontario Premier Doug Ford and his cabinet were also unavailable. Joining us now, however, is federal Conservative Labour critic Kyle Seaback. Hi, Mr. Seaback. Good to have you on the show. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
I'm going to pick up exactly where we left off in that conversation with Mayor Brown, which is him urging the federal government to levy additional counter tariffs to essentially take a harder posture against the Trump White House where trade is concerned. I know that your party is very critical of the outcomes thus far, but do you agree with the position that the federal government should be levying additional, more punitive counter tariffs at the very least?
So look, I don't know that we accelerating the trade war by trying to actually put other tariffs on CUSMA compliant goods is the answer to that. It's something that should be looked at, and whether or not that's going to be a response that's effective should be examined. But I think the really important question is, like, how did we get here? And we got here because we've entered this bargaining with the United States in a weakened position. We can't I just want to paint this picture. Imagine if we had developed over the last 10 years critical minerals, rare earth metals that the United States needed for their economy. But we couldn't do any of that because we have anti-development legislation like Bill C-69 and others. We can't get our oil and gas to tidewater so that we could say to the Americans, well, we're actually going to divert more of our oil into the international markets. So we would have bargaining position with the United States in these tariff discussions. But we don't have any of that because the Liberals have done that. And Mark Carney has not done anything since he's been Prime Minister to try and fix any of these things. We still have an industrial carbon tax. We still have an EV mandate that is very challenging for our auto workers. I know you recall all of the CEOs of the auto workers went to Prime Minister, went to Mark Carney and said, please get rid of the zero emission vehicle mandate. It's making it harder for us to manufacture cars in Canada. There's solutions to these things. Improve our bargaining position by strengthening the Canadian economy. And actually, in this last campaign, we campaigned on removing the HST from Canadian-made vehicles. I've talked to Unifor auto workers. We actually have the capacity to increase auto production in Canada if more Canadians bought cars. So why aren't we looking at these solutions as, again, a pressure tactic in our negotiations with the Americans? But Mark Carney and Liberals aren't doing that. They're threatening legal action, which, sure, I used to be a litigation lawyer. 10 years down the road, after the lawsuit's over, maybe something happens. That doesn't help auto workers now.
I take your point, certainly, on the focus on the economy as it stood entering in on this. And I've asked ministers who oversee the files that you mentioned numerous questions over numerous months about that very thing. But we do, to intimate that we don't have the leverage that we could. I mean, we have some pretty strong leverage. Right now, the U.S. is taking in a ton of our oil, for example. We send electricity, a number of provinces send electricity directly to U.S. states. And I'll circle back to where my question started was, I know your focus is on what your party thinks the government is doing and has done wrong. But if your party were in power right now in this moment, would you be using that leverage? You know, if you say we would have had critical minerals, well, we have oil, we have electricity, would you be withholding that? Would you be taking a more aggressive stance against the Trump White House? Because otherwise, I don't know how what you would do would be any different than what the current prime minister is doing.
Well, we can't withhold oil and gas. We can't withhold electricity. Those things would be hugely problematic. But what we can do is do things to create, like, all the investments moving to the United States. And we know that. That's a combination of Donald Trump wanting that investment and the regulatory environment in Canada being so complex that businesses aren't prepared to risk capital to make the investments that we need to get projects going. So I go back to what I said. The best time to plant an oak tree was 25 years ago. The second best time to plant it is today. So a Conservative government elected 6 years ago would have been moving on, 6 months ago, would have been moving on all of these things. We would have eliminated the industrial carbon tax, which would help our steel and aluminum. We would eliminate the zero emission vehicle standards, which is going to help our auto. Would have implemented the Made in Canada auto solution that we talked about. All of these things. What we're getting from the Mark Carney Liberals is we're going to strengthen the auto sector. He said that in March. He hasn't. We're going to have a deal in July 21st. We haven't. And all the while we're bleeding while they're not taking any action. We actually have ways to strengthen the Canadian economy to create resilience in the face of some of these tariffs, and they're not doing that. That's the problem.
It might create resilience, relative to the positioning with the United States. But when you highlight the industrial price on carbon, for example, and the EV mandate, those are two things that our free trade agreement initiated under the Harper government and completed under the Trudeau government view as very central by Europeans. We are looking to diversify markets away from the United States towards Europe. Is risking some of the main tenets, or at least on the environmental side of agreements with Europe and specific countries, is that worth risking in order to, maybe create a better environment vis-a-vis the United States with no guarantees of that materializing?
Well, first of all, I don't think we export a lot of steel to the EU, but the EU actually exempted their steel industry from a carbon tax, and we haven't done it. In fact, Mark Carney has said the industrial carbon tax is going to go up. But if you're looking at a 25%, if you're looking at the tariffs on steel and aluminum, imagine if we eliminate the industrial carbon pricing regime so our steel and aluminum is cheaper. That actually might increase our exports to the United States, despite the fact that these tariffs are in place. If we eliminated the zero-emission vehicle mandates, that would give certainty to the auto producers that it's a good place to invest without this uncertainty on what the conditions are going to be. If we had a policy to exempt all Canadian-made automobiles from HST, look, Canadians would choose to buy that Canadian vehicle if it's going to be $10,000, $12,000 cheaper or $8,000 cheaper. So what I say is, it's very hard to negotiate and figure out what exactly Donald Trump wants. When you can't control that variable, you have to control what you can control within your own country. There's lots of levers that the government could be pushing, whether it's on the development side, whether it's on the auto side, all of these things, and they're just not doing it while at the same time not getting a deal. It's a double whammy, and it's the workers that are paying the price.
They have paused, to be fair, the EV mandate, and they've got the rest of it up for review. They have, with your party's support, passed a bill known as C5 that will allow Cabinet in the development of resource projects to override certain environmental policies that exist. And just a few days ago, the Prime Minister didn't rule out that being the case. They're just not doing it necessarily in the way you want them to. But does that mean that they're doing nothing? It wouldn't appear that's the case.
Well, so I don't think what they're doing by setting up an office to pick projects is the answer to creating the investment environment that we need in Canada. What we need to do is eliminate, for example, all these pieces of legislation and the red tape to create investment certainty. What businesses say is the risk of trying to get these big projects off the ground is too high because of regulatory uncertainty, so they're not going to make the investments in Canada. And the Liberals setting up an office where they get to pick projects sounds to me like another opportunity for the Green Slush Fund to take place. It just leads to all kinds of opportunities for bad actors. We wanted to create an environment where all businesses get the opportunity to take risk because they know that there's a predictable process for whether or not their project's going to be improved. That actually creates, if you have 15 companies trying to get these things done, you create more investment in Canada than if you have 5 companies that are handpicked by the Carney government.
Okay, I've got to leave it on that note. I'm out of time. Mr. Seaback, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thanks a lot. Kyle Seaback is the Conservative Party's Labour critic. And our front bench with Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Scampsey will be here a little bit later on in the show to talk about the political impact of Stellantis' decision. Coming up first, though, after a short commercial break, one-on-one with Newfoundland and Labrador's incoming Premier. Premier-designate Tony Wakeham wins a majority for the Progressive Conservatives, ending a decade of Liberal rule. The new Premier will join us live next.
Tremendously proud of the campaign that we ran. We kept our message positive. We focused on the challenges we face. We focused on the opportunities ahead.
We knew it wasn't over until that final buzzer and all the votes are counted. And tonight, we all know it because we all feel it. There is nothing quite like a comeback.
Progressive Conservative leader Tony Wakeham is Newfoundland and Labrador's premier designate. The Progressive Conservatives defeated the incumbent decade-old Liberal government, running with a platform focused on affordability, healthcare, and public safety. The party ended up with 21 of the 40 seats in the legislature, compared to 15 for the Liberals and 2 for the NDP. The incoming premier, joins us now on his plans for the province. Hi, Premier Designate. It is a pleasure to meet you, and a heartfelt congratulations on your win.
Oh, thank you so much. Great to be here.
I appreciate you making the time so soon after that win to join our program. I wanted to start off on Churchill Falls, just because from what I observed, it was a really clear point of demarcation between your campaign and the one that the Liberals ran. And I think it's fair to say, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, but under the current terms of the deal, you don't think it's a good one for your province. And you've promised to launch an independent review. My question to you, Premier Designate, is if the independent review concludes the opposite, that in fact it is a good deal for your province, will you not hold a referendum?
Well, the first thing we're going to do is what we've been talking about since this was first announced, the idea of having an independent analysis done. That's what we wanted since day one, because we need to learn from our past. And one of the major recommendations coming out of an inquiry that we did here in Newfoundland and Labrador relating to Muskrat Falls was that any deal of this magnitude should be sent for an independent review before it is sanctioned, before it is finalized. So that's something we've been calling for. And we've continued to call for that. A number of concerns about this MOU have been raised by many people in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I want to take it out of the political arena. Let's move it in to make sure that we do that independent analysis, bring it back. Let's see what the recommendations are coming out of that. We renegotiate, and then we will take a final deal before the people of Newfoundland and Labrador.
So basically the plan is, once you renegotiate based on whatever the conclusions of that review is, no matter what at that point, whatever the final deal you arrive at as Premier, you will put that to a referendum? Is that an accurate way of describing it?
That's the intent. I mean, I think the important thing for me is that, as I said, this is too important for the future of Newfoundland and Labrador, and it shouldn't simply be left in the hands of 40 politicians at the House of Assembly. This will have a generational impact on Newfoundlanders and Labradorians for years to come, and I want to make sure that we get it right, that the principal beneficiary of any deal are the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, and they will have their say.
I acknowledge you're just a few hours on the job, but how soon do you intend to launch that review? Like, in a perfect world, how fast would the process you just lay out actually unfold over?
Well, I think that will depend on the amount of time it takes for us to get sworn in to become in the legislature and get this moving. But I would like to say I will not be held to any artificial deadlines. Again, this is too important, so we need to make sure we take our time to do that, to get it set up in a way that we can actually have that review done. And let's see what comes out of that, and then we will renegotiate. But again, I go back and say that the principal beneficiary of any deal has to be the people of Newfoundland and Labrador.
Premier, you made Premier Designate, you made a number of promises during this campaign on health care as well. Just for people who are watching outside of your province, I'll name some of them. Covering medical costs when a patient has to travel, bringing more nurses into rural areas, expanding training and retention, buying new MRI machines. At the same time, your province, and I know you're well acquainted with the numbers, is facing a deficit double in size from the one that was projected at the time of the budget. And you made very fiscally impactful promises as well during this campaign. Things like raising the basic personal income tax exemption, permanently reducing the provincial gas tax. Do you anticipate, while you are Premier, that the size of the deficit will increase, or are you prepared to make cuts on the spending side?
I'm not talking about cuts right now. What I'm talking about is helping Newfoundlanders and Labradorians balance their own budgets first, and then we will focusing on balancing the provincial budget. But many of the items that I have talked about and the expenditures that I've talked about can come from the existing budget. I believe there are lots of opportunities within the existing budget for us to choose differently, to make better choices, and to stop the wasteful spending that has happened over the last decade.
I understand that perspective. I guess why I'm asking is, and again, there are numbers that I know you're familiar with, but ones that I think a lot of Canadians might not be. For example, the size, the net debt in Newfoundland, if you divide it per capita, how significant it is versus other provinces. And just the carrying cost of that alone, I believe, at $1 billion in this fiscal year. That's all money that could be going to areas that people in your province really care about. Instead, it's just going to servicing the debt. So why isn't, against that backdrop, reducing the deficit more of a priority for a conservative like yourself?
Well, it's not that it's not a priority, but it's not something that you can simply turn around and cut your way to prosperity. For me, it's about developing a strategic plan, a long-term vision of how we will get there, because this deficit, as you have said, has grown over the last 10 years. So that's the first thing we do. But at the same time, there are many people in our province who are being left behind, who the cost of living has had a significant impact on, who are looking for better access to health care, are looking for safer communities. And it's those people that's what my first concern is, the people in Newfoundland and Labrador right now. So we need to help them. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. And then I will turn around and make sure that we put a plan in place that will return us to balanced budgets and then onwards from there.
And I would never take away from the needs, as you described them, of people who, both in your province and across the country are facing an affordability crisis. But you know as well as I do that big deficits and higher debt loads often contribute to inflationary pressures. When you say that you will turn at some point to the size of the deficit and to managing a path to balance, can you give people in your province an idea of when that point might occur? At what point will that become a higher priority for your government?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to do is we have to get in there and we have to get under the hood. We got to really start looking at what our deficit truly is. As you know, the last Liberal government turned around and included revenues in their budget for this fiscal year that they will not collect for a number of years. They're related to the tobacco tax settlement. This type of analysis, this type of budgeting has to stop. And we have to be realistic with the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's what I intend to do. I will open up the books to the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. I will be able to tell them exactly what our fiscal situation is. And then we will work a plan and a strategy and how we can make that better. But I intend to invest in Newfoundland and Labrador. I intend to make sure that we create industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's where you go back to the whole MOU discussion. It simply can't be about us simply treating our hydroelectricity as a product to be sold. We need to start thinking about it as a product to be developed. How can we use that to create industry within our own province? I believe there are lots of opportunities to do that, and I'm looking forward to getting in, forming government, getting in the legislature, getting under the hood and finding out exactly what we can do.
I have just a few seconds left, Premier Designate. I wanted to ask you, since I'm here in Ottawa, is there an intention or a plan at all to meet with the Prime Minister? And what is your first ask of him?
Well, I had a great conversation today, actually, with the Prime Minister, and we talked about nation-building projects and making sure that our offshore oil, Beta Nord, for example, is a major development of our offshore oil. We recognize that one of the things that is a barrier to our offshore oil development is the cap emission. So we need to be talking about these things. If we're truly interested in nation-building projects, then Newfoundland and Labrador would like to be part of that, whether it's to do with defense spending or whether it's to do with Beta Nord or other projects that are happening right now in our country. I had a good conversation with the Prime Minister, and I look forward to having more.
Did he by any chance tell you he'd get rid of that emissions cap?
No, I wish he had. But that's something that we will have another chat about.
Okay, trying to get a little news there, Premier Designate. I really appreciate your time. And again, once again, congratulations on your win. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That is Premier. Thank you,
All right.
Premier Designate of Newfoundland and Labrador, Tony Wakeham. Now, the Premier Designate's election, get this, leaves only one provincial Liberal government left standing in Canada. That's over in New Brunswick. Susan Holt is the Premier there. BC and Manitoba, of course, have NDP governments, and Conservative parties now lead the rest of the country's provincial governments. Take a look at that map there. We will take a quick commercial break here on Power Play. On the other end of that break, we're going to head back to our top story. Stellantis heads south in the wake of Trump's trade war. How should the Prime Minister respond? Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. Our front bench is next.
The company has commitments under different types of agreements with the government, including the fact that we provided support for the retooling of the very Brampton facility that right now is sitting idle. So we will make sure that we push the company and we hold them to account.
Why would the Liberals allow a company that's getting billions of tax dollars, supposedly to create jobs, take those jobs to the U.S.? It sounds like another disastrous Liberal boondoggle.
What my message to the Prime Minister when I meet him on Thursday is if you can't get a deal, let's start hitting him back.
Political reaction there with 3,000 Brampton, Ontario jobs at risk after automaker Stellantis announces it's moving Jeep Compass production to the United States. The company says they have as yet announced plans for the Brampton plant, but Prime Minister Carney has issued a blunt written statement in response to the announcement saying investments in the auto sector will continue to be affected until a, quote, more certain trade environment for the North American auto sector is established through the upcoming review of the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement. Let's bring in the front bench to talk about the politics of all of this. Sharon Carr is a CTV News political analyst and former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Next to her, that is Sebastian Skamsky, who, oh, no, actually, sorry, we're going to Laura first. I thought just because you were sitting there, I'd go to you, but nobody's ready for it. So Laura instead is with Enterprise Canada. She previously worked in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's office. Jamie Ellerton is the principal at Canaptus and worked for Minister Jason Kenney during the Harper government. And back to where we started, Sebastian Skamsky, there he is, sitting next to his BFF. He's the former Director of Media Relations to Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. Hey, guys. Nice to see you. Wish it were on a more positive note, Laura. I got to start there, and I think some of the clips that you saw there perfectly exemplify the back and forth that is existing right now about what the federal government's next move should be. I know that the federal government has signaled, you know, we're not going to hit back harder because the prospect of a deal on other stuff like steel and aluminum and energy exists. How much leeway do you think they have before the voices like Doug Ford's grow even louder, or Patrick Brown earlier on the show, that force them into a more aggressive posture? Like, how long do they have?
Oof, it's the million-dollar question. I wish we knew how long they had, but it is encouraging to see Minister Joly is, you know, taking control where she can today with her letter. And I think that what we're starting to see is Canadians are going to start to get antsy, right? This is 3,000 jobs. That's a lot of people, right? And I often come on your show and talk about the human element of this because it hits me really hard. That's a lot of people, that's a lot of families, and it's the whole ecosystem around it. And so I do think we have to ground ourselves in that too and think about those people today when we're analyzing what's happening. But I also am trying to see the forest through the trees. And I am trying not to panic because this industry has weathered the 2008 financial crash, NAFTA renegotiation 1.0, COVID, and so I am choosing to believe there is going to be a path forward here, frankly, because I need to have some hope for those 3,000 people.
And I totally understand that. I guess, and Sebastian, I'll go to you next. My question is, this is 3,000 people now. My sense is this is a company doing exactly what Donald Trump has said he wanted them to do through the use of tariffs. Pick up their investments, move them to the United States, and for the country of, for the U.S. to reshore all that manufacturing. Like, I don't get the sense that this is the end of the story. I feel like it's the beginning. What does that, in your view, necessitate from a political perspective from the federal government in this moment?
I think, Vashi, you're entirely right. I think a point I was going to make is that this isn't some grand conclusion to the events that we're witnessing. It is, I think, just the beginning, as you said. Of course, we had GM before, and so this isn't entirely the first company affected. But we're going to see more of this. And Mark Carney, who has promised Canadians, promised the very workers, NDP voters, and a very wide coalition of people that he would negotiate a positive deal to protect their jobs. I think we're going to see increasing heat under his feet on this. We had the self-imposed deadline in July, another one in August. It is October. Both have come and gone. The outcome of that, unfortunately, is these 3,000 jobs. Let's not forget that is part of the over 97,000 jobs across every sector that has been lost while Mark Carney has been Prime Minister. And so when we see Prime Minister Carney go down to the Oval Office like he did last week and give away all of our leverage and provide every concession to the Trump administration, and in return, we have Trump's trade advisor saying that really the tariffs on autos is going to be a permanent fixture in our relationship, I think really does not bode well for the future of workers and the future of our industry here. And it's very concerning as we enter further CUSMA renegotiations down the road.
I think my gut feeling, Sharon, tells me like two things can be true at the same time. That I understand the conservative critique that this is not the Mark Carney that was promised during the election, nor the actions that align necessarily with the posture taken during the campaign. At the same time, I feel like there is a proposition being put forward inherently by the Carney government right now, which is we're doing this stuff because we think it will lead to a better outcome. My question for you from a political perspective or a strategic perspective is like, how long do they have before Canadians kind of, take back some of the leeway that they've given them, or like, how long do they have to produce that outcome?
I would say they have a little bit of time, but not enough, as anyone would want. And I think the biggest issue here is that this is 3,000 jobs today. What is it going to be next, right? So the federal government and the Prime Minister have to really look at this from a perspective of, we have Donald Trump, the president, who is in office for the foreseeable future, and one day it's one thing and the next day it's another, and this is a direct cause of his threats on the industry. And I think that where Prime Minister Carney has to really step in here is that I know that we have CUSMA negotiations that are like on the horizon, but we also have these tariff discussions, and I think that as much as we want to wait on things, we also have to put a bit of fire under not only the politics of it, but under industry. I personally think that I want to remove the politics from this conversation for a second, because it doesn't matter who is the Prime Minister at this point in time. As long as Donald Trump is the president, we are going to see situations like this. We've heard his protectionist view. And the biggest problem I have with this is that for companies like Stellantis, and I just saw right before we came on here, Minister Melanie Joly did send over a letter stating essentially this is not acceptable, and that their previous subsidies that they received were contingent on things. And I think that the government has to show that they are going to take the full legal force, whatever force. They need to come down as hard as possible, because the auto sector is one of the sectors in Canada that receives a lot of government funding. And I was one of the people who cheered on the investment that Stellantis got in Windsor a few years ago, because, sometimes the government has to step in. But if they're going to take the government's money and then walk away when it's not convenient for them, someone needs to have a come to Jesus moment, because this is not acceptable.
But that's what's so striking, Jamie, to me. It's like, of course, Stellantis knows that. They know the contract they signed. They know the obligations that they made to the Canadian government. But they've built the cost of that into the decision that they've made. Clearly, the cost of going up against Trump and, the cost of staying in Canada versus moving your production to the United States is not, as detrimental to them as what it would be. Like that cost is greater than the one that they'll pay here in Canada, which, like, to me is very significant, right? Because I get pursuing all the legal stuff, I get all the recourse that we have in that vein, but ultimately, if it signifies something that more companies are going to do, we have a way bigger problem than just Stellantis on our hands.
Yeah, I would agree with that framing, Vashti. And I think one of the risks here for Prime Minister Carney is his approach on this matter with the Trump administration has essentially been to lead by photo op, show engagement, show he's like got a seat at the table. While at the other hand, he's trying to tell Canadians, hey, trust me, we're going to figure this out. And we're now going on month 6, if not longer, of him selling that message. And I think to Sharon's point, that runway is starting to get shorter and shorter. And I think Canadians are going to feel more antsy. And I think one of the things that really stood out for me when you hear the commentary on this today is you obviously have a lot of people, the head of Unifor, very entrenched in it's literally the Auto Workers Union. Mayor of Brampton, this is where the facility is. They're, of course, going to cry about it and scream and ask for someone to do something. But ultimately, I think Canada needs to wake up to the reality that we are not going back to the U.S. trade relationship as it existed prior to this Trump administration. And we need to start making long-term decisions that are going to actually benefit the Canadian economy over the long term. I would point out former Minister Ed Fast had a piece in the Hub today talking about canola and how we have to stop letting China put us over a barrel and divide Canadians, and instead actually build up the market for long-term global needs, diversify a bit, and make those investments today so that we can reap that benefit for decades to come and not be put over a barrel. And I think Canada has to be very clear-eyed. We need to get away from those that want to go to Ottawa, try and get your subsidy, pay a bunch of lobbyists to get the money flowing, only to then have these people walk away. That playbook is dead. It's going to cost taxpayers dearly, and it's going to do very little for the long-term prosperity of Canadians. And until we have a political leader actually make the case and start to show what an alternative can be, I think not only are you going to see the politics just become more fraught, but I think the economic impact in Canada is going to also be quite fraught. And every day that we're not moving forward in a new reality is the day we're stuck in the past and falling further and further behind.
Well, on that note of optimism, I'm going to take a quick commercial break. The front bench is sticking around. We're going to continue the conversation after that break. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Power Play, and our top story, Stellantis' decision to move operations on the Jeep Compass from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois, creating thousands of jobs in the U.S. and putting thousands of jobs in Canada at risk. I'm here with the front bench, Sharon Carr, Laura D'Angelo, Jamie Ellerton, and Sebastian Skamsky. Sharon, I'll start with you on this round. Tomorrow, Premier Ford is meeting with Prime Minister Carney, and he has said pretty explicitly today he would like the Prime Minister to hit back harder. Premier Eby said the same thing about the forestry sector. Pardon me, he wants to see more. How much of an issue do you think this is going to be for the Prime Minister, the lack of kumbaya, which really I think officially has disappeared?
I think it is a problem in the sense that we saw this last week with Premier Ford and Premier Canoe kind of disagreeing on the whole follow-up from your interview, actually, with the Chinese ambassador and on canola and on EVs. I think we're finally seeing this crack amongst our federation, amongst provinces, and it's going to be hard because every province has what's vital for them. The auto sector is extremely consequential in Ontario, so while parts of the prairies might not feel the impact from it, Ontario will. So I think the Prime Minister has to tread this very carefully, because once that federation starts to fall apart from the provincial side, it just becomes overly political. But I do think that one of the biggest issues here is Canada is a small, tiny, like a really tiny little pea in a massive pot compared to the U.S. And our ability to negotiate with them, we have to be extremely, extremely strategic. And at a certain point, we are going to have to hit back. We went through that period of time where Doug Ford was saying, you know, I'm going to cut U.S.'s electricity and do X, Y, and Z. We just need to get to a point where Donald Trump is willing to meet people halfway so that stuff like this doesn't happen with businesses. Will we get there? I don't think so, but I can be hopeful.
You do get the sense, though, Sebastian, that Doug Ford is heading back in that direction. Like, he keeps saying nothing's off the table, which is what preceded the last time that he actually did make good on that threat. Is that an issue politically for the Prime Minister?
Well, Doug Ford is a critical ally to the Prime Minister. He's not the Prime Minister, though, and the Prime Minister, unfortunately, had made the decision, as part of the negotiations, a very puzzling decision, to give away much of our leverage. He took off counter tariffs without really telling Canadians at the time. He folded on the digital sales tax, for example. He, last week, made a surprising commitment to President Trump to provide $500 billion in investment into the United States. So, I mean, I'm not really sure where we can talk about putting our elbows up right now and becoming more fierce in our approach to the Americans when the Prime Minister has done exactly the opposite. I will also note, of course, the Prime Minister can do a lot of things on his own, even if the premiers disagree. And it is the Prime Minister who made the pledge to Canadians to build those projects within Canada that would proof us against tariffs and other turbulence from other countries that he has made no progress on. So if we can't get it done because there is a challenge politically abroad, he can at the very least do things domestically. That's his job as Prime Minister. And he should get on that right now.
I'm not trying to cut anyone off. I've got 2 minutes. I want to make sure both Jamie and Laura get in. Laura, both David Eby and Doug Ford have their own industries to worry about. How much of that additional pressure punctuates the political orbit of the Prime Minister?
I think a lot of it is punctuating right now. I think that, to Sharon's point, we are now seeing the First Minister's table start to crack, right? The premiers are exerting whatever political influence they have, both, I think, privately, although that's conjecture, certainly publicly, right? We've been watching it with Smith and Eby, who, frankly, have both made really smart political moves over the past little while, but we're starting to see that now with Ford, with Wab Kinew. That is going to continue because these are real people's jobs, and it is those premiers' jobs on the line if their constituents continue to suffer.
Last minute to you, Jamie.
Yeah, I think when you come back to where the state of the auto sector is, at the end of the day, these are American companies, and they are under existing political pressure, more likely than not, to continue to repatriate their capital and the jobs that go with it back to America as a result of what's coming out of the White House. I think Canada needs to wake up to this reality. There are a lot of men and women who are quite skilled in manufacturing. We need to look at government policies, both here in Ontario and at the federal government, to make Canada a more competitive place to invest, to attract capital and make the products that people want. I don't think anyone believes that a government EV or a government Canadian car is going to be a bestseller in the world, propped up by taxpayers and taxpayers alone. And the sooner we can shatter that delusion, the better we can on to get making real decisions that are going to make the best term for Canada's economic long-term interests and get on with the job of doing it.
I'm going to leave it there. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Our wonderful Wednesday front bench, Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, Sebastian Skamsky, and Laura D'Angelo. We'll take a quick break. Our takeaway is next.